Okay, let's just dive right into it. Today, we're unpacking a truly fascinating report that investigates the origins of a concept that has completely shaped Western civilization. We're going to deconstruct the idea of eternal conscious torment. Now, whether you grew up in a strict religious household or you just exist in a culture that's been heavily influenced by these historical ideas, understanding exactly where this concept comes from fundamentally changes how we view history, power, and honestly, human psychology itself.
Here is our roadmap for this explainer. First, the translation problem. 2, 3 early church views. 3, the emperor's decree. 4, the economics of fear. 5, hell in other traditions. And finally, the verdict.
Did Jesus actually teach eternal torment? I mean, wow, that is a loaded question, right? It challenges our most basic foundational assumptions. To answer it, the authors of our source document had to look way past centuries of institutional tradition to see what the ancient historical texts actually say. And what they found is incredibly complex, and frankly, deeply fascinating.
Our source for today's explainer is a very deeply researched, though non-peer-reviewed, report by Alvarez Consulting, and we're going to review the entire PDF today. Drawing on some heavy-hitting scholarship in biblical linguistics and church history, it presents a super compelling hypothesis that the modern doctrine of hell is actually a political artifact. It basically argues that the version of hell institutionalized by the Roman Church bears almost no resemblance to anything Jesus actually taught.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, the translation problem, what the texts actually say.
Okay, this is wild. Look at how 4 totally distinct ancient words from 3 different languages with completely different meanings were all just collapsed into the single English word, hell. You've got Sheol and Hades, which basically just meant the grave, a totally neutral underworld where everyone goes. Then there's Tartarus, which was specifically a prison for fallen angels, not human beings. And finally, Gehenna, a literal physical valley outside Jerusalem. By combining these 4 completely separate concepts into one terrifying English word, translators essentially allowed a specific theological agenda to be retroactively glued onto the original texts. It's a massive linguistic flattening.
Let's really zoom in on that last word for a second. Gehenna. Of the 12 times it appears in the New Testament, 11 of those are attributed directly to Jesus. But according to the report, Jesus absolutely wasn't talking about some metaphysical, otherworldly torture chamber. He was referencing a literal, smoldering physical valley right on the edge of Jerusalem. It actually had a dark history of child sacrifice, and in his day it was used as a burning garbage dump. So Jesus was using this very vivid, recognizable local landmark as a metaphor for the gravity of moral failure. It would be kind of like a modern teacher pointing to a local toxic landfill to describe a wasted life.
And this right here brilliantly illustrates the translation gap when we look at the Greek words used for punishment. Jesus specifically used the word kolasis, which in classical Greek means corrective punishment aimed at rehabilitation. Think of it as pruning a tree so it grows better. But the report argues that the later institutional church needed the concept of Timoria, which means punitive vengeance and permanent suffering. So to put it simply, Jesus used a word that meant temporary correction, while the later institution demanded a word meaning infinite punishment.
All right, moving on to Section 2, 3 early church views. The diversity the church erased.
You know, you might think everyone always agreed on this stuff, but no way. For the first 4 centuries of the faith, there was absolutely no binding orthodoxy on what happened after death. 3 completely distinct positions were out there competing openly. You had eternal torment, which was heavily championed by Augustine and obviously eventually won out in the West. But you also had annihilationism, the idea that unrighteous souls just simply cease to exist. They're consumed, not tortured forever. And, incredibly, you had universal salvation, or Apokatastasis, which is the belief that all rational souls are ultimately, eventually restored to a union with God.
One of the absolute greatest champions of this universalist view was Origen of Alexandria. This guy was a towering intellectual in the early church. He basically argued that a God of infinite love and power wouldn't logically allow a piece of creation to suffer forever. For Origen, the fire wasn't literal physical flames being poked by demons. As we see here, he viewed it as an internal, purgatorial fire of the conscience. It's the soul's own burning awareness of its failures. The idea was that given enough time and correction, every single soul would bend back toward God.
So, what changed? That brings us to Section 3, the Emperor's Decree, the turning point at Constantinople.
As we track this timeline, we can really see this tragic shift from open intellectual pluralism to absolute dogma. For hundreds of years, universalism was actually mainstream among the intellectually sophisticated wing of the church. But then, in 553 CE,
Emperor Justinian convened the Second Council of Constantinople. Now, the report paints Justinian as this obsessive theological micromanager who desperately needed doctrinal unity to keep his empire together. Under his heavy-handed influence, Origenism and the whole hope of universal restoration was officially condemned. This wasn't just a theological debate among monks, it was a massive imperial shutdown.
Which leads us to ask, why? Let's look at Section 4, the economics of fear. Follow the motive.
If we treat this like a forensic investigation, we have to ask, cui bono? Who benefits? Well, the report argues that a permanent hell acted as the perfect, totally cost-free social technology. Think about it for a second. If everyone is eventually saved, why on earth would you submit to an unjust ruler? Why pay your tithes? An eternal hell conveniently outsources the enforcement of imperial and church order directly to God. It disciplines the poor into accepting their poverty, it regulates marriage, it protects kings from rebellion, and above all, it perfectly positions the institutional church as the one and only exclusive gateway to escaping this terrifying fate.
And you literally cannot talk about the economics of fear without talking about the Middle Ages and the sale of indulgences. The church taught that you could literally pay money to reduce your loved one's time in purgatory. As Johann Tetzel famously, or maybe infamously, pitched, as soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. They effectively turned the terror of the afterlife into a massive, highly lucrative subscription model. It literally funded the construction of St. Peter's Basilica. And the authors of the report point out that the Protestant Reformation didn't really fix this core terror either. They argue figures like Calvin just doubled down on eternal conscious torment with even more ferocity.
Let's widen the lens a bit for Section 5, Hell in Other Traditions, a comparative theology breakdown.
When you stack it up against other worldviews, the institutional Christian doctrine of infinite torture stands out as a massive outlier. Look at Rabbinic Judaism, which is the very tradition Jesus emerged from. Gehenna is seen as a purgatorial process that lasts a maximum of 12 months. 12 months. In Islam, while it is heavily debated, a significant classical tradition argues that Gehenna is a temporary state of purification. And in Vedic or Hindu frameworks, hell realms are entirely cyclical, karmic, and temporary. The idea of permanent, inescapable torment is incredibly unique, and not in a good way.
All right, let's bring it all home. Section 6, the verdict. Let's synthesize the evidence. Reviewing this entire PDF, we are looking at a profound disconnect here. On one side, we have Jesus' message, rooted deeply in a Jewish framework, utilizing words of temporary, loving correction and telling these beautiful parables of a God who searches tirelessly for the lost sheep. On the completely opposite side, we have the institution's hell, a bureaucratic weapon of fear that demanded a permanent, eternal consequence, basically just to optimize the institution's own survival, enforce its taxation, and suppress any theological alternatives.
So, I want to leave you with this final, genuinely provocative thought from the report to chew on. The fire that consumes is not the same as the fire that tortures. It really makes you wonder, right? What happens to our understanding of the divine when we finally separate the original teachings from the institutional utility? If the doctrine of eternal torment was deliberately constructed by identifiable political authors for identifiable political motives, what beautiful, restorative possibilities were erased to make room for it? It's a massive question, and for sure, one well worth exploring further.